Hello and welcome to this environmental studies revision video on cycles of matter. And this is a particularly important area. Cycles of matter, whether they're being water, carbon or nitrogen, are all examples of closed systems, and we'll be looking particularly today at carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle. So you need to be able to talk your way through the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is a flow of carbon between biotic and abiotic factors. So the best place for you to start with this at all times is in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, obviously as CO2, and that comes out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So plants are called photoautotrophs because they're using the light of the energy from the sun to capture that carbon dioxide and turn it into organic glucose. So plants fix carbon dioxide into glucose in photosynthesis. So then what happens? Well, then the animals may eat the plants, so primary consumers eat the plants, okay, and obviously that carbon goes into the animal, and that can also go into the future animals along the path. Now, all living things, whether it be a plant or whether it be an animal or even bacteria, have to respire even. So they respire, they do have to reproduce, but they also have to respire. So they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through respiration. Now, when living things, whether it be a tree or animals, die, they break down and get broken down by decomposers, and they become what we call detritus, okay, and they break down and are decomposed. When the bacteria, I don't want you to use this word, I want you to use decomposers. When the bacteria decompose dead living things, they return the carbon dioxide also to the atmosphere via respiration. And if they fail to decompose due to the conditions that they're in, maybe it's in anaerobic conditions, slowly dead living things will turn into fossils. And obviously for a long, long time, this balance of carbon in our atmosphere and in the solid part of our world between the biotic and abiotic components was balanced. But now, because of human activity, our combustion of fossil fuels has meant that a huge amount of carbon dioxide is being returned to the atmosphere and unbalancing that cycle. So some of the key words you need to know, which I mentioned: carbon fixation is when carbon from carbon dioxide is locked into solid components, i.e. into glucose. So you need to know that carbon sinks are things that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it, and this becomes part of the organism's biomass, or it could become part of fossil fuels. Inorganic examples also exist, and carbon dioxide can be turned into calcium carbonate, and this happens in the oceans where carbon dioxide might be absorbed by the oceans itself, and seashells in marine organisms absorb that carbon dioxide, turn it into shells, and then as they die over thousands of years, they become sedimentary rocks. Soil also can hold some carbon dioxide, and obviously carbon dioxide is also found in the atmosphere. So there is something called the carbon budget, and you can see here you might be asked to calculate how much carbon dioxide is either being emitted or absorbed into the area based on the different things. But the key thing is to remember carbon dioxide can come out of the atmosphere due to photosynthesis. It can be absorbed by photosynthetic algae in the sea and plankton, and the oceans can absorb carbon as well, but the other factors are releasing it. So at the minute there is a higher amount as a net release of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere because of this area here of fossil fuel combustion and deforestation and fires. So we need to understand this carbon budget and human activity. So the diagram here puts some numbers onto the carbon budget. And this carbon budget shows you quite nicely the impacts of human activity. So you can see here that surface phytoplankton absorbs about 100 of carbon dioxide, and it releases about 100, slightly more absorbed than released. And you can see here that biomass on the land absorbs 100 and releases slightly more than 100 as well. And why is that the case? Well, if you look at the numbers, 5.5, so this shows us why carbon dioxide is increasing. We're adding 5.5, in this case, gigatons of carbon dioxide a year via fossil fuels being burned, but also deforestation is what is causing this number to be above 100, and it adds about 1.6 into the atmosphere. And in terms of fixation, what we can say is that phytoplankton takes 2.4 out, and new forest growth only takes 0.5 out. So what is happening is there is a balance here that is unbalanced. More is going into the atmosphere than is being absorbed overall. And human activity has now added over 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So obviously you'll do more about the carbon cycle when you talk about climate change. So we're going to focus more in this video on the nitrogen. So you need to understand that all nutrient cycles, whether it be carbon dioxide or nitrogen, are ones that are natural, and we're going to talk about them not being changed by human activity. Obviously, human activity can disrupt. So you just need to be aware in both the carbon cycles we mentioned earlier and also in the nitrogen cycle, there is microorganisms involved. And the microbes are better known as saprobionts, but you might also call them decomposers. And these decomposers feed on the dead remains of organisms or the waste that the organisms produce. These organisms use what we call extracellular digestion, and the important thing is to remember is these are respiring when doing so. So whenever they break down any dead material, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So nitrogen cycle then is a key cycle because we need nitrogen for growth and repair. It is part of our proteins and our DNA. There is loads of nitrogen in the air, and that number doesn't change because we can't break this strong triple covalent bond that exists between nitrogen. The only natural way that can happen is through bacteria, who can do something called nitrogen fixation, which turns it into ammonia, or through lightning. And we also can use the artificial process of the Haber process. So you need to understand this process, and this process, sort of, if I talk you through it, we can break down into a couple of key stages. So the first stage is nitrogen fixation, and that is how does this nitrogen get from the air into the living material, into biotic organisms. So the main way, naturally, is via something called rhizobium bacteria, which is bacteria that lives in the roots of leguminous plants. So things like peas and beans are examples of leguminous plants. And they live in what we call root nodules, and those bacteria are able to absorb the nitrogen from the air and convert it into ammonia. Those plants are then eaten by animals, and then it enters the food chain. There is also nitrogen bacteria that can fix nitrogen in the soil, and obviously lightning, as we mentioned before, but humans also use the Haber process to do so. You do not need to know any details of the Haber process other than it's an artificial human mechanism to fix nitrogen from the air and produces ammonium or nitrate, which can be used to make fertilizers. So once the plants, if we follow where we are now, once the plants have been eaten by the animals will either die or produce waste products, which takes the nitrogen into the soil in the form of organic nitrogen or urea. That then is converted in a process called ammonification into ammonia by soil bacteria. That ammonia is then oxidized in a process called nitrification, which occurs in oxygenated soil, which turns it into nitrites and then nitrates. You can see here the oxygen being added. You then have one of two things happening. If there's enough oxygen, the plants will be healthy around there and they will absorb that nitrogen back into the plants. So that can then enter leguminous plants or normal plants, which then get eaten by animals, and the cycle happens over and over again. But if that happens in a non-oxygen area where there's anaerobic conditions, different bacteria exist which can do a process called denitrification, which return nitrogen from the air. So this explains why farmers want soils with lots of oxygen in them, so this process keeps happening, whereas if there was no oxygen, this process happens. Now, one other thing can happen, which links to another part of your module, and that is if you add the fertilizers to your soil too early, you can get leaching happening, which is where nitrates enter the river, which causes the process of eutrophication. So you need to be able to talk your way through these 4 stages. So nitrogen fixation, rhizobium, bacteria, or free nitrogen in the soil, plus lightning and Haber process, take the nitrogen out of the air and fix it into solid compounds such as ammonium or nitrates. Nitrification is where the oxygen is added, which takes it from ammonium to nitrates. And denitrification is the return of nitrogen to the air due to these anaerobic conditions. Decomposition and ammonification is this bit here. So when you have the dead animals and plants, or the urea or the feces in the soil, it turning into ammonia. So just a reminder, nitrogen fixation, how does it come out of the air from nitrogen to make ammonia, which gets turned into amino acids? There are these rhizobium bacteria which live on the roots in the root nodules, as we call them, of leguminous plants, and they are specialized plants that have a symbiotic relationship with this bacteria, and they are examples of the pea family of plants. And those are the type of plants that farmers will plant on soils that have low nitrogen in them to increase the nitrogen over several. Artificial ways, as I said, is Haber process. Obviously, it is a natural way. Lightning, because it's got so much energy, it can split the nitrogen into 2. So again, you need to be able to talk your way through this. So the process is you've got nitrogen in the air, free living bacteria in the soil, and rhizobium in leguminous plants absorb the nitrogen, turn it into ammonium ions. Animals eat the plants, which then turn it into waste products, or the animal dies. Then nitrification happens, which turns it into nitrite and into nitrate. That can be reabsorbed back into the plants, if there's no oxygen in the soil, you get denitrification happening. Once it goes back into the plants, animals feed off this, and then again it breaks down and then goes back into the plants again.